Should one race in order to live, or live to race?
La Régie Renault a choisi la Formule 1 pour deux raisons. La première, c'est son niveau technique très élevé. Et ceci impliquait un niveau d'exigence considérable. La deuxième, c'est sa notoriété mondiale et le fait que Renault soit une marque mondiale avec des ambitions mondiales et avait besoin de trouver un objectif de compétition qui est une expression internationale et une diffusion internationale.
Well, I've always enjoyed motor racing. When I was a child at school, I found it a fascinating subject, and it really dominated everything I thought about when I was young. That terrific enthusiasm pushed me into racing, supported me throughout all the difficult times, and even today, when we're quite successful, it's still as strong as ever. There's no doubt about that. It's just something from within.
There seems little in common between the reasons why a major automobile manufacturer and a small specialist team go racing. For a long time they coexisted or raced against one another, but these days it's not uncommon to see them associated with one another to form the ideal combination. In the early days of the car, the reasons why a manufacturer should go racing was scarcely any different to current reasonings. Quite simply, racing was a way for those manufacturers involved to prove to their clients the qualities of their products, for the cars that they raced were virtually identical to those which they sold. In the 20s, however, the technology of Grand Prix racing needed to be more specialised, and so bigger manufacturers such as Peugeot, Fiat, even Mercedes moved away from racing, allowing specialist sports car manufacturers to take the stage. This then was the great age of Delage, Alfa Romeo and Bugatti, who found that racing not only enhanced their corporate image, but also fed the bank balance, as they were able to sell racing cars to wealthy gentlemen drivers. And until the end of the 60s, Grand Prix cars were painted in their national colours, British racing green, Italian red and French blue. This suggested that Grand Prix weren't simply contests between manufacturers and teams, but also between great industrial nations. In the quest for status and propaganda, the leaders of the Third Reich soon appreciated the prestige to be gained from winning with German technology, flying the flag which denoted the increasing power of Nazism. So, at the beginning of the 30s, they began to encourage their major motor manufacturers to enter Grand Prix racing as it was then. But it wasn't enough just to participate. It was imperative to win, and even, if possible, to totally dominate their rivals. Consequently, Mercedes and Auto Union were largely used to prepare for battle. The two major German manufacturers were tempted by large subsidies and launched their campaign with a standard of equipment unknown until then, and results weren't long in coming. Faced by this formidable armada, better organised and extremely well equipped, the opposition of Italian and French specialist manufacturers crumbled. Just as quickly and efficiently, a few years later the same nations would come up against similar opposition of a much more ferocious nature. Unfortunately, all this could be seen in hindsight, but few of the nation's leaders could actually see the nature of the threat so obviously demonstrated by their future enemy. In the meantime, the Silver Arrows won all the great races between 34 and 39, perfectly fulfilling the role and succeeding in the mission which the Nazis had assigned them. In the eyes of the world, they represented and symbolized the efficiency of the regime that promoted them. The idea of motorsport as an instrument of propaganda had just begun. Today, thankfully, there are no examples of Formula One being used to such ends. Nevertheless, the very expensive subsidy which Fiat has paid to Ferrari since the late 60s is motivated by similar considerations and with similar reasoning. Fiat is exceptional, in that it owns almost all the major Italian car manufacturers, but the directors see Ferrari as flying the flag for Italian national industry as a whole. So each Ferrari victory is seen as being a selling aid, not only for Fiats, Lancias or Alfa Romeos, but also for machine tools, washing machines, and a host of other products of engineering. Besides, Ferrari have never changed their traditional national colours. In the 50s, motor racing in Britain gave rise to a whole new generation of specialist Formula One car builders, some of which would dominate Grand Prix over the next 3 decades. But it was the rich industrialist Tony van der Velde, manufacturer of the famous bearings of the same name, who would be the first to attempt to win the World Championship. To drive his Van Walls in their attempts to beat the Ferraris and Maseratis, he hired the best of the English drivers, Stirling Moss, who was, with Fangio, the best driver in the world at the time. The campaign nearly worked. Van Wall won the Constructors' Cup in 1958, but Moss just failed to win the title, which went, in spite of fewer wins, to Ferrari driver Mike Hawthorn. At the same time, with the support of British Steel and with the aim of promoting British industry as a whole, British Racing Motors, or BRM, was created, which, after an extremely hesitant start, slowly began to establish itself as a #1 team, led at one time by the talented Frenchman Jean Bérard. When van der Velde closed down his team due to ill health, BRM took up the challenge and reached its peak in 1962, when Graham Hill and the team won their respective world championships. The 60s were the golden age of BRM, but sadly they went into slow and irresistible decline in the 70s. But the team ran many great drivers in its time, Jackie Stewart for instance, but also the great Mexican driver Pedro Rodriguez, the superb Swiss driver Joe Siffert, and even Austria's Niki Lauda at the start of his career. And Jean-Pierre Beltoise won for the first and only time at Monaco in 1972. It would also be BRM's last. But the end of the 60s saw a new structure in place in Formula One. The association between a major industrial company who would shoulder the greater investment, the engine, and a specialist manufacturer who would build and run the cars.
Colin needed a new engine. We had impressed him suitably, and he thought that I was likely to be able to design him a suitable Formula One engine, so he tried to get some money to support the venture, and I'd been bold enough to say I thought that we could make a Formula One engine for £100,000. And we went to see a few people, and then Ford took immediate interest and agreed to pay us the money to make a Formula One engine.
I think that's really great. I think that this is the first time we've been able to coordinate the build of an engine and a chassis together and design each one to suit the other. And with the sort of weight and simplicity and power that keeps coming up, I think we're going to have a fabulous motor car.
Yes, I quite agree. Very reasonable. I would say that was about 50,000.
Walter Hayes was a public relations director with great foresight. He could envisage the huge profit that Ford could make out of its Formula One involvement. Thanks to him, Ford invested a relatively small sum of money and gained an enormous amount of prestige and publicity by participating in just such an operation. In structural terms, the Lotus 49 was innovative because the engine was a stressed member, a structural part of the chassis which carried the rear suspension. This was something that would later be universally adopted on all Formula One cars. Its V8 engine was designed and developed in the workshops of Cosworth, a small English engineering company which until then specialised in building competition engines based on small capacity production blocks. It would therefore have seemed risky to have thrown them suddenly into the deep end, but that's where Hayes and Chapman were clever, correctly assessing their potential and having confidence in them. They would be paid back more times than they could ever have hoped for. Two Lotus Fords made their debuts on June the 2nd, 1967 at the Dutch Grand Prix, and it was sensational. After Graham Hill dominated practice, Jim Clark won the race ahead of Brabhams and Ferraris. It would be the first in an extraordinary series of more than 150 wins for the V8 Ford Cosworth, which would establish a record unprecedented in the history of motorsport. But the use of this engine would not remain the exclusive right of Team Lotus, and gradually it would take over as a power unit for the majority of the field, to the point where, but for Ferrari, Formula One might quite simply have become Formula Ford. Obviously, the entire structure of Formula One had been transformed. There was no longer need to invest huge sums in the manufacture of an engine. All a team had to do was to buy a Ford Cosworth to be sure of being powered by a competitive engine. The era of what Enzo Ferrari disdainfully called the assemblatori, the kit car manufacturers, had begun.
We seem to manage to beat them all with, first of all, Lotus, and then the Matra came out and with Jackie Stewart driving, and then McLaren, and we gradually got most of the good teams, and therefore we won most of the races.
Between 1968 and 1982, 15 years, the V8 Ford Cosworth DFV won titles for no less than 12 world champions. Stewart, Rindt, Fittipaldi, Hunt, Andretti, Jones and Rosberg all owed their titles to that power unit. And it would win its 154th and final victory in the United States East Grand Prix in Alboretos, Tyrrell, after 16 seasons of great and loyal service, an incredible record of staying power. This success story marked a break in the pattern of the history of Formula One. In spite of occasional Ferrari success, it now appeared that the task of making a complete Formula One car had become a handicap for a team, as was illustrated by Matra's experience.